I've been called back to tell some stories. Hello, here we are on the YouTube. It's Halloween, Samhain, that night when the veil is thinnest between the now and the there, between the then and the why, between the what and the where. I don't know. But for a long time now, before there was a Halloween, there was a Samhain. There was this night. Before we invoke the traditional night of eating the sweets we've gathered off strangers. Remember, kids, there's 2 nights like this in a year. The rest of the nights we say no. Do not go up to strangers. Do not ask them for things. Do not let them near you. But Halloween, we say go and knock on their door in the dark. And at Christmas, of course, we say go to sleep. Someone's going to break in later. But we get the benefits of it. That is what the point is, isn't it? Hopefully you can see me and hopefully you can hear me. My name is Gav. It is Gav Cross. And I am a storyteller. And I'm very lucky to be doing this, to be telling stories. So I thought I'd pop on and tell some stories live for Halloween, and then I'll leave it up. Some silly things, bits and pieces from all over the place. Now, I've split it into 2 parts. This I've said 7+, and then I'll have a little break, and then I've said 12+. Let me explain. But before we do that, and I'm really happy to do this in between the stories, I got a little hello to Lexi and Amelia. I think I've met one of you, haven't I? Lexi and Amelia, hello. I'd love to know if you're here. Do pop it in, and I'll give you that Halloween shout out. Does a Halloween shout out have to have something like a ooh with it? I don't know. I wouldn't do that. That would be, I don't think I would, my dignity would hold. So, in this, I shall tell you some stories, and I shall start very, very gently, and then we might go to a little spooky place. Do not worry. Hello, for Tumch Orgo. Sound and visuals are perfect. Thank you. And good evening, Barry. Nice to see you. That's nice to hear that I can be seen and I can be heard. Yes, so I'll start very gently, and then I might tell you a true ghost story, depending on whether or not you feel you're up to it, towards the end. And that's about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a pause. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll come back. I've got an original story wrote specially for tonight by Lisa Williams, and I shall read the classic Monkeys Paw. But this time I've got something here that I don't know if I should be sharing it. I don't know. Well, I don't want to get your hopes up, but we could all get everything we wish for. But that's the second part of the evening. So also really happy to say, in between stories, just to have a little chat with you. That would be really very... Now, I've got a story here that I'm not going to read to you. It's a story that kind of justifies my ability to say horrible, terrifying, ghostly things to young people. I mean, there's plenty of people who say, no, I shouldn't, or don't come back, that kind of thing. I'm looking at the book right now, and I'm not going to read it to you. On the book, I'll describe. There are 3 horrible creatures staring malevolently. Their intent is plainly not kind. At a child, a young girl walking through the countryside. These 3 malevolent beings, I see one is a beast, snaggle of tooth, horned creature, covered in hair and claws. The other is, well, let's address this. Very often female characters are referred to in a derogatory way. Of course, down time, women have been healers, have been helpers, been there at the beginning of life, been there at the end of life, have been there with soothers and portents and potions, and they are often rather roughly described, perhaps in literature, perhaps by people, perhaps by cruel people, as witches. These isolated women have been important, but this is definitely a witch, because she's got she's got like the hat and the so there's a beast, and then there's a third character, spectral, translucent, aged, eyes that have seen too much, chains rattling, staring at the life force of this child, each of them wanting their own. And I'm not going to read you this terrifying book. I mean, if you can for yourself guess which section of the library this book would be, which genre. Always an interesting word, genre. I always feel a bit clever just saying the word genre. I mean, I should refer to myself from now on as Jav. Ghastly stories for gruesome children by Jav. And a genre. You'd imagine which genre of book this would be, which section of the library of the bookshop it would be. Of course, in the infant section, of course, because what I'm describing, all green screen, is The Baddies by Julia Donaldson, one of her latest books. And she's got a lot of books. We got a monster, we got a witch, and we've got a ghost. An absolutely genuinely terrifying image of a ghost aimed, I think, at the under fours. Let's have a look, shall we? It's a traditional ghost. It breaks through walls. Yeah. Oh, but bear with yourself. Oh, brilliant illustrations there by the very popular illustrator who works a lot with Julia Donaldson, Axel Schleffler. Axel Scheffler. So I'm not going to read that to you because I think it's a little bit too... and also I get in a bit of trouble, I think. But I am going to read a part of a classic book. Because I do love books. I do love children's books. And I love spooky books. And this one, I remember this from my own childhood, which was a long time ago. And I bet, let's see, type it in if you're here, if you know what this story is. And it begins like this. This is how the story begins. On a dark, dark hill, there was a dark, dark town. In the dark, dark town, there was a dark, dark street. In the dark, dark street, there was a dark, dark house. In the dark, dark house, there was a dark, dark staircase. Down the dark, dark staircase, there was a dark, dark cellar. And in the dark, dark cellar, some skeletons lived. You're right. It's Funny Bones. I love Funny Bones. Janet and Alan. A green screen. And Alberg. Funny Bones. What a classic book this is. What a beautiful... I told you I'm going to start easy. I'm going to ease you into it. And then I'm going to say horrible things. I love it. A real classic. And in the dark, dark cellar, some... I'm going to willingly say skeletons. I know it's skeletons, but I am going to say... Good evening, everybody. Yes, you remember it. Good. I'm going to say skeletons. Now, you should pronounce it skeleton. I would like to point out that not very far from where you are sat right now. I know there is a skeleton. And worse than that, it's inside of you. Yeah, because otherwise you'd be all kind of like wibbly-wobbly, wouldn't you? Some skeletons lived. There was a big skeleton and a little skeleton and a dog. Skeleton, obviously. What shall we do tonight? Let's take the dog for a walk. One night the big skeleton sat up in bed. He scratched his skull. Imagine that. It'd be cold, wouldn't it? And frightened somebody. Good idea. And that's what they do, isn't it, I suppose? So the big skeleton and the little skeleton and the dog skeleton left the dark, dark cellar, climbed the dark, dark staircase and stepped into the dark, dark street. I mean, this was written in 1980, 37 years ago. Cost of living crisis has been around a long time. Turn that light off. They walked past the houses and the shops. They walked past the zoo and the police station, and they went into the park. So get this is a book for kids. And the skeletons are out on the streets, ready to terrify people. The big skeleton scratched his skull. What shall we do now? He said. Let's play on the swings, said the little skeleton, and throw a stick for the dog and frighten somebody. Yeah. Good idea, the big skeleton said. So the big skeleton and the little skeleton and the dog skeleton walked round the dark, dark pond, past the dark, dark tennis course and up to the dark, dark swings. They must have good eyes. The big skeleton and the little skeleton played on the swings, and they threw a stick for the dog. Suddenly, something happened. The dog skeleton chased the stick, tripped over a park bench, bumped into a tree. It's going to be a bit. And ended up in a pile of bones. Look at that, the big skeleton said. He's come to pieces. What shall we do now? Let's put him together, the little skeleton said. So the big skeleton and the little skeleton put the dog skeleton back together again. They sang a little song while they did it. Oh, no. I'm not going to sing it on my own. You've got to sing it with me. I'll know if you don't. Don't ask me how. The toe bone's connected to the foot bone. The foot bone's connected to the leg bone. The leg bone's connected to the hip bone. The hip bone's connected to the backbone. Woofo. To be fair, it isn't going to be easy to do, is it? That looks like early dinosaurs from Crystal Palace, South East London. I haven't got a clue. And then they got mixed up. Is that a toe bone? The little skeleton said. Where does that one go? Said the big skeleton. If you were presented with your entire skeleton in front of you and you had to put it back through your ears or something, you'd struggle. When they'd finished, the big skeleton said, Look, that dog looks a bit funny to me. So he does, said the little skeleton. And they got his tail on the wrong end and his head. Foo, said the dog skeleton. I don't mind it, actually. I don't mind it. What I find creepy about these pictures are the toes. You'd think it'd be the skeleton themselves, but it'd be the toes. At last, the dog was properly put back together again, and the big skeleton and the little skeleton sang another song. These bones can bark again. This is very childish. I'm warming you up. These bones can bark again. These bones can run around the park again and scare all the children in their butts. I missed that bit. The big skeleton scratched his skull. That reminds me, he said, we forgot to frighten somebody. Then let's do it on the way home, said the little skeleton. Good idea, said the big skeleton. I wish I had a nice little boy to frighten. I wish we had a nice old lady. That's not really very... This book is not really recommending positive behaviours. So the big skeleton, the little skeleton and the dog skeleton left the dark, dark swings and went out into the dark, dark town and tried to frighten somebody. Trouble was, there wasn't anybody. Everybody was in bed. Even the policeman in the police station was in bed. You can tell it's from the 80s. There are policemen in police stations. Even the animals in the zoo. Of course, the skeleton animals were awake. Where do they keep... See, this is why this stuck in my head. I don't know where do they keep the skeleton animals? What is that? I mean, it looks a bit like a pig. But that curly tail and that spine, imagine that with flesh on it. That's not a pig. That's a monster, some kind of... Gee up, Nelly. I mean, look at that. That's a tank. Let's have a ride on the elephant skeleton, the little skeleton said. Let's have a word with the parrot skeleton. The big skeleton scratched his skull. Let's keep out of the way of the crocodile skeleton, he said. And when they were back in the street and when they still could not find anybody to frighten, the big skeleton said, what shall we do now? Let's frighten each other. The little skeleton scratched his skull. Let's frighten each other. That's better than nothing. Good idea, said the big skeleton. What frightens you? What frightens you? I'd love to know. So after the big skeleton frightened the little skeleton frightened the big skeleton and the little skeleton frightened the dog skeleton. That feels a bit cruel. And the dog skeleton frightened them both. They hid round corners and frightened each other. They climbed up lampposts and frightened each other. They jumped off out of dustbins and frightened each other. To be fair, I haven't put my dustbins out. That means I'm going to have to do it after this, and it'll be dark. It'll be oh so dark. I haven't changed the light in my... I've got this gap between the houses, you see. Ginnel, they call it round here. They call it all sorts of things, an alley, a ginnel. What do they call it near you? And I've got to go in there, and it's got to be dark. And I sometimes use the light from my telephone, but it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. And that is how the story ends. On a dark, dark hill, there was a dark, dark town. In the dark, dark town, there was a dark, dark street. In the dark, dark street, there was a dark, dark house. In the dark, dark house, there was a dark, dark staircase. Down the dark, dark staircase, there was a dark, dark cellar. In the dark, dark cellar, some skeletons lived. And they still do. Funny Bones by Janet and Alan Alberg. Do you have a cellar? I can't talk to you about my cellar. I've promised never to mention it. Are they frightening things? Damp places? When I was little, and I was little once, I was obsessed with ghost books. Oh, this kind of thing, let me show you. These are more modern. Things like, Osborne books of ghosts, yeah, or tales of mystery and imagination, and, paranormal guides, the evidence, and the arguments. In fact, this one's really very useful. It does state a kind of possible scientific proof for ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. What it says here, and I'd like to read it to you. Under the section entitled In Search of Ghosts, Scientific Explanations. Scientific, it must be real, because one of the authors is, the consultant, Tim, has got a BSc. Got a BSc, doesn't say in what. Modern theories of ghosts reject the idea that they are literally the spirits of people. Here is how some people explain ghosts. So one of the explanations for ghosts, according to this book, is telepathy. Ghosts of living people are linked with telepathy, the ability to transfer thoughts to others. When the message is really strong, the receiver's brain may interpret it as a visual image or ghost. For example, an Australian farmer who had a ghostly visit from his wife while she was in town far away. On his return, he found his wife had been killed at the exact moment he saw her. At the point of death is often a time when a ghost pays a call. And that's the scientific explanation for ghosts in the Usborne Hotshot Book of Ghosts. It's telepathy. I've put my door chain on. This is spooky. You should. You should. It'll also keep out kids wanting sweets, won't it? Yes. Yes, I'm going to tell you a ghost story, but I'm going to tell you an adaptation of a ghost story. And it's an old story. It's been told in many, many different ways. So my version is as good. And the point is, your version could follow this. I've got it. I've been inspired from this book. Beautiful book I've got called The Barefoot Book of Strange and Spooky Tales. Retold by Andrew Fusek Peters. And I very much enjoyed this. I'm going to tell you now a very scary ghost story. Do you want to know how I know? It's a very scary ghost story. I know it's a very scary ghost story because that's what it's called. There it is. A very scary ghost story. Far away, not so long ago, there lived an old man, alone, in his house. His house was 5 miles from any other living soul, isolated in the wilderness. The old man lived his life. Actually, this is not a story. That sounds like bliss, doesn't it? I mean, if it had Wi-Fi and that after 5 miles there was like a co-op or something, I'm in. But I understand as a young person that might sound terrifying. An old house, 5 miles from nowhere. One evening, by the flickering light of the fire and the candles, the old man heard a wailing in the garden. Now, this is where I am genuinely going to need your help. I can't do this on my own. And you can't not do this, because then that would just leave me. So what I'm going to do is, when I point to you and you know it, I need you to make that ghostly sound. Ow. You've got to do it, and I'll know through, because of course, you know, we're talking about ghosts, through telepathy. I'll know if you don't do it. Okay, let's practice. Are you ready? Ow. Only 3 of you did it. Oh, Basil Botler's here. Ghostly. Only 3 of you. One last chance. Do it with me. When I point to you, take a breath. And then say, ow. I am the ghost of the bleeding finger. And I'm coming to you. And I'm coming to you. And I'm coming to you. Ow. The old man was terrified. He put the chain on the door, and he backed up the stairs, never taking his eye off the door. The door rattled, and he bolted to his bedroom and closed the door and hid under the covers. And then he heard the front door opening. I haven't prepared this sound effect, but if you've got that one, we'll just do it. And then he heard the front door opening. Oh, I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I'm coming to you, and I'm coming to you, and I'm coming to you. Oh, the old man heard. That's rubbish. The footsteps. Coming up the stairs, closer and closer. The old man jumped from under the covers and climbed under the bed. Outside of his bedroom door, he heard the sound. Oh, oh, I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I am coming to you. I am coming to you. I am coming to you. Wow. The door opened with a huge creak. You do that. Bigger door. And the footsteps got closer and closer to the bed. Oh, deafening. Oh, I am the ghost of the bleed. That was the blood dripping. That was like, I know. It's like the blood dripping off the finger onto the floor. It's terrifying, I know. I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I'm coming. The bed started to move. The old man was underneath. I am coming, and the bed started to slide away. And I am revealing to the old man the horror of the ghost of the bleeding finger there above him. And I am coming to you to ask, have you got a plaster? It really hurts. Ow! A very silly story. One perfectly told to be told around a campfire, and you can tell that story. Let me know if you ever do. It's a classic. It's sometimes referred to as the bloody hand, the bleeding hand, but that version is inspired by this version, a very scary ghost story, and I picked that up in Strange and Spooky Stories. And there's some crackers in here. I'm going to enjoy reading that, and I hope you enjoyed that story too. And I hope you joined in with the sound effects. And if you didn't, know this: it's fine. You do what you want to do. You've got your own agency. I'm not telling you what to do. I do love a spooky story, but what I really do like is a horrible story. I tell you what I'm going to do. I didn't think I was going to do this. I'm going to show you the story I'm not going to tell you. I've got it here. I've got several copies, actually. I'm a bit obsessed. I collect it. I'm going to say something horrible now. And I'm sorry. I'm booing everybody. I hope, is he booing me? I'm going to say something horrible now. This story you all know, and I'm not going to tell it. It's a story of child murderers. But it is also a ladybird first favourite tale. It is also a good night, sleep tight storybook. It is also a well-loved tale, a good night, sleep tight storybook, a ladybird first favourite. It is designed by Marks and Spencer, nonetheless, as a first reader's book. A story of child murderers. Prepare yourself for Hansel and Gretel. There it is. Look, that's what it is. Everyone thinks about that, don't they? They think about a house made of chocolate and sweets and cake. That's what you think about with Hansel and Gretel. That's what you think about. The reason I'm not going to read this to you, is because it's absolutely horrific. What happens in it? According to the story, the boy gets snatched, Hansel, for eating the old lady's house. And then he's locked away in part of the house to be fattened up to eat. And then Gretel's made to do the work. And then Gretel's asked to clean the fire, the oven. And Gretel tricks the old lady and then shoves her in the oven. And then let's find it. Shoves her in the oven. And in this one, I'll show you this one next. Now, according to the story, when the old lady goes into the oven's not on. And then shoves her in the oven. Oh no, Marks and Spencer, they like to do it their own way, their own special way. They take the old lady and boil her. Because in this, Gretel shoves her in the oven, closes the door, so that's a trapped lady, and then switches the oven on. Chooses to switch the oven on. That's absolutely horrific. This story of child murderers murdering an old lady alone in a forest. The bit you all forget is just after that, they rob her. They rob all her gold. With no witnesses. Oh no, she was definitely a witch, and so we had to cook her. We had to cook her and eat her. We had to cook her and eat her. And steal all her gold. Of course they're going to say that, with no witnesses. What's your proof? Oh, well, she's horrible to Hansel. She locked him up in the corner of the house and wouldn't let him out. She was like fattening him up to eat him. That's what she did, is it? Yeah, in a house, yeah, made of cake. According to your story, a house made of cake. Hansel could have been out within 10 minutes just by eating his way through. These are the things we say to children. If there are young people watching this, it's not your fault. You've turned out the way you've turned out. It's the fault of whoever read you these stories, and that's why I didn't read it. I wouldn't do that to you. I wouldn't suggest that you go back to these old fairy tales and reread them with your eyes open. I wouldn't say that. Of course, there is one story that I definitely wouldn't tell you tonight. It starts with a small child being taken into the forest to be murdered. Snow White. Snow White. If you've got Disney Plus, get you. You go to Disney, you go to the Halloween films, Snow White is literally the #1 recommended Disney Halloween film. It's not a documentary about little Tweety birds that do the washing up. No! It's about the attempt of murdering a child, and then it finishes with a poisoned child in the forest, in a glass coffin. And a prince rides past and stops and looks and thinks, oh, what a pretty girl. I'm going to stop my horse and get off and give her a little kiss. You can't do that. Imagine if you did that. So I will not be reading Snow White. And I will not recommend that you sit alone in the dark watching Snow White. It's far too scary. What I will do to finish those is I will tell you a true story. And then there'll be a pause. And then I'll come back at 7 o'clock and I'll read you a couple of stories, including the Monkeys Paw. I don't believe in ghosts. And I don't believe I've ever seen a ghost. Everything I'm going to tell you is true. It happened a good long while ago. I mentioned to my daughter today I was going to tell this story. She said, what story? I said, well, you'll have to watch it back to find out. She was small. Little enough to need a travel cot. And those parents here know those things. They're horrible to put together. And you find a corner and they're bigger than you imagine. And you put the travel cot in the corner. And we were visiting my daughter's granny, who lives in Wales. And we put the travel cot, and it was my turn that night. And I'd put my daughter in the bath and pyjamas and a story and a cuddle and popped into bed. And my daughter was awake and was babbling along, but I said, good night, my darling. And I turned the light off and went downstairs. A little while after this, my daughter's mother came down and said, you'd left the light on. I said, what do you mean? You left the light on in the bedroom. I said, I didn't leave the light on. I switched the light off. You left the light on. I'll go and turn it off then. I've turned it off. I turned it off. I was pretty sure. It can't be guaranteed, but there you go. A little while later, not long after, my daughter's granny came down and said, she's awake up there, standing up in her cot. You left the light on. Said that to me. I didn't leave the light on. In fact, you turned the light. I turned the light off. I turned the light off. So I turned the light. Now, the light was right by the door, and the cot was right in the other corner, furthest corner from the door. And there was just that thing, that tingle on the back of the neck, the fight or flight, the amygdala, the cortisol, is it? The fear just tingled on the back of the neck. I don't like that bedroom, never liked that bedroom. That was Granny talking, that was her teenage bedroom. What do you mean you don't like it? But it was enough, just to make... So I went upstairs. Now, I turned the light off. My daughter's mother turned the light off. Granny turned the light off. But in those few short minutes that I'd gone upstairs, the light was on by the door, in the far corner of the cot. My daughter standing up on the cot, blah, 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 wide awake, smiling, laughing. I'm glad she was laughing. She was laughing. She was tiny. And I stood there and I clicked. It was a good solid click. It was an quite old switch. I remember it. I can feel it. And it clicked off. And it clicked on. You couldn't... I was trying to think logically. Maybe, the switch was just popping itself up. But it was clicking. Off, on, off, on. So I went over, gave my daughter a little hug. Soothed her down. Night, night, darling. Night, night, darling. Went to the door, switched it off. Crossed the landing. Popped to the loo. I wasn't in there long. And I came out. And the light was on. Not more than 2-3 minutes before, I'd switched it off myself. No one had come up the stairs. It's a small house. I would have known. The light was on. My daughter was standing, smiling, laughing, thankfully, with the light on. And I walked into the bedroom and I was tense. And I didn't want to do this, but I had to, for my own And for my daughter, with a smile, I said night-night, and I switched the light off. And as I'm standing there in that room, the light came on, and I saw it. I saw the reason. So I backed away from the room. My daughter was fine, standing up, smiling, laughing. And I called her mother and I called her granny. I said, come up, I know. Come see. And I looked at them as they came up the stairs. I know why the light comes on, I said. And as they came in, the light was on and I switched it off. And in the gloom, in the corner of the bedroom, where my daughter stood in her cot smiling because all her loved ones were there, we watched a hand rise out of the cot. My daughter's hand. She pulled the cord that was above her bed. The second light switch in the bedroom. An old bedroom with a second light switch in the corner on a long cord so you could switch it off in bed without actually getting out of bed. And I turned to Granny and said, had you forgotten that light switch on a cord? And Granny went, oh yeah. Not a ghost. Just rather an archaic light switch for old people. Blah, 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 blah. My daughter was smiling, but inside, here's the thing that annoys me most about this story. For about 5 to 10 minutes, I was convinced it was a ghost. And I was like, no, it's got to be me. I've got, how am I going to, no one's going to believe me. But that's a completely true story. Every single word of it. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in things like that. But what I do believe in are stories. I love spooky stories. I love creepy stories. I like nasty stories. I like monster stories. And I hope you've enjoyed my silly stories as well. I hope they haven't been too spooky for you. But if you like them a little bit more spooky, then I'm going to come back at 7 o'clock. At 7 o'clock, I'm going to come back with a classic old supernatural story and a new one as well. But if you do come back, now is the time to go and get yourself a little snack. Pop to the loo if you need to. Don't let me tell you what to do. Thank you very much for your company, though, if you've not been coming back. My name's Gav Cross. I tell stories all over the place. And I'd like to come to your place to tell a story. I tell stories in schools, in libraries, in festivals and theatres. I say terrible things to nice children and nice things to terrible children. So you can imagine what I think of you tonight. In the meantime, have a lovely Samhain. Samhain is traditionally a time when you give up something new or you face something old and you throw it onto the fire, real or imagined, and you move forward. It's thought to have been a new year, actually. It's all connected, of course, originally to the moon, then the seasons. It's the start of winter. And you know what happens in winter, don't you? You start looking forward to Christmas and sweets and treats, yes. Oh, Barry's going to change their underpants. Too scared, too easily scared. Thank you, Barry. What a horrific image. I enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed it too. I'm going to leave this stream on, but it'll be some holding nonsense. In the meantime, if you enjoyed that, you can leave me a review, or there's a link down below to my link tree, and you can give me a follow. If you haven't done so already, I would really value your subscription. I'm trying to get up to a point where I can do some portable live storytelling. I want to do more of these. So your subscription and your like apparently does count. However, what counts the most for me has been your company. If you've watched this back, leave a comment or send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. Other than that, maybe I'll see you at 7 o'clock. If I don't, then I'll miss you. Bye-bye. Hello, and welcome. Welcome back if you were here for part one, or welcome if you are joining me on this second part, or even because I'll be downloading it and then splitting it. Too much information. Welcome to Ghastly Stories for Gruesome Children and Beyond. My name is Gav Cross, and I am a storyteller. It is actually my job. It's the time, other than when it's the time when I feel the most at home, saying terrible things to nice people or nice things to terrible people. It brings me a big calm. So I thought I'd do this for Halloween and invite you to join me. And well, I had fun. Part one with some classic spooky stories and a true story, a true ghost story. What I've got for you is a couple of things, and I'm always up for a little chat as well. So if you want to ask questions or a chat or a shout out or a hello, there is a little chat there. You can throw that in. I won't look at it while I'm reading the stories. I wanted to just address a couple of things. I say I'm terrified of horror things. I'm not a horror movie fan, but I like a ghost story. This is a good one I got recently. I bought this at Norton Priory. Fantastic. There's a fair few ghosts there, I reckon. And it's a very old republished book where you can look up an area and it'll tell you about the ghosts. That are in it. And I was sharing. I have a Twitch stream. I love Twitch because the people on there are nuts and lovely. And so what we were doing was we were looking for a place, and then we'd look it up. And then I've forgotten it now. I should have done more prepared. Is it the Lanes in Brighton? There's one in the Lanes. There it is, page 36. So, the Lanes in Brighton, if you know Brighton. It was the area of Brighton known as the Lanes is all that remains of a small ancient coastal town of Brighthelmstone. There you go, I didn't know that. Nowadays, it's one of the attractions of Brighton, drawing visitors who wander around the crowded narrow streets. One of them is called Meeting House Lane. There it is. Meeting House Lane. While strolling down this, you will come across a bookshop. Love a bookshop. Love a bookshop. Love a bookshop. Can't walk past a bookshop. Can't walk past a set of shelves with books on saying, buy some books. Love it. You will come across a bookshop, opposite which is a bricked-up doorway in a wall. There it is. The doorway was blocked in the 19th century, but it is still used by the ghost of a nun. Beyond this wall, in the 12th century, was the priory of St. Bartholomew, and during the nun's lifetime, it was being guarded by soldiers. The nun fell deeply in love with one of the soldiers, and her love was reciprocated. They decided to elope and make a life together. Unfortunately, their absence was soon noticed, and a party of soldiers was sent out after them. They were captured and brought back to the priory. The soldier was executed for desertion, and the nun was walled up in the tiny space and left to die of starvation. This was the traditional way of disposing of nuns who had broken their vows, as it entailed no blood spilling by the senior members of the order. While the miserable nun was dying in a slow death, psalms and prayers for her spirit were said in the chapel. Evidently not enough was done to satisfy this particular nun's spirit, for it is still abroad today. Well, I'm glad she gets a nice holiday. I love that. It's horrible if it's true. The traditional way of disposing nuns. I've got some nuns that I need to dispose of. What should we... just brick them up. Just brick them up. We're going to the dissolution of these monasteries and these priories. What should we do with the nuns? Just pick them up. Yeah, that's what we... Absolutely horrible. Now, it's not the first time. If you're a little bit, as I say, like me, and you like a spooky book, it's not the first time you would have heard of people being bricked up alive. And it's classic. I mean, it goes right back to Antigone, the third story of the Oedipus trilogy. It goes right back. All of these things. So, how comes this terrifying punishment is celebrated, elevated once again as a punishment in a book and a subsequent TV show and some huge movies? Gunshots. I don't know if you can hear that. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. We've got the sad story of Henry. What's sad about Henry? Well, Henry, if you know, is a grumpy train. Look at that. Grumpy Henry there. I won't go through the whole story, but what I will tell you, but Henry's so grumpy that he wouldn't come out of the tunnel. He's obviously got something going on. He's got some issues there. And so what they decide to do with Henry, we shall take away your rails, said the fat controller, and leave you here for always and always and always. They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of Henry so that he couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore. They brick him up. The traditional way of disposing of nuns is the traditional way of getting rid of grumpy trains on Sodor. Have you ever seen a more haunting image? Look in the eyes. Look in the eyes. Look in the eyes. Why? I can't justify it. I don't know why they should. I'm going to read you a story that was written specially for tonight by Leicester's finest, Lisa Williams. It's a story called Home Alone. Not that. I wouldn't be reading that. It's not that story, Home Alone. It's not that story, Home Alone. I don't even like the film, but I like this story, and I hope you do too. So, whilst I read this story, and before I go into the second story, which is a longer read, I'd like to know the things that scare you. List the things that scare you. Use the chat. Say hello, and tell me the things that scare you. Written specially for tonight's Ghastly Stories for Gruesome Children. Home Alone by Lisa Williams. It was, of course, a dark and stormy night, and my parents had gone out to the cinema, leaving me home alone in a house making the weirdest noises ever. Even the cat had disappeared, probably outside, stealing fish from next door's pond, his favourite hobby. Anyway, back to feeling sorry for me. Please, because I've not told you the worst bit yet. I'm home, alone, in a house making spooky sounds, and there's no internet. I know, right? How am I even alive to tell this tale? I mean, it was sounding amazing, wasn't it? Home alone, watch what I want on the TV, order something super unhealthy, but it spiralled into some kind of sick horror show, hasn't it? Have you ever been at home without the TV on? I doubt it. Only the worst kind of sicko would admit to it anyway. Let me tell you, it's the scariest thing in the universe. Worse than your dad's face when he wakes in the morning. Almost. So I sent a text message to Mum, like it's the time of the actual dinosaurs, and she basically says, get over it. Houses make some weird old sounds. And then said, if you've got nothing to do, why don't you tidy your room? Yeah, Mum, calm down. This is no time for jokes. So I went upstairs to lie on my bed and feel sorry for myself for a bit when I realised the house was not just making noises. The spare room door was actually moving. I'm not going to lie. That room has always freaked me out a bit. Mum keeps her wedding dress in there. I mean, why? I've seen the photo. She looks like a huge haunted meringue in it. So why'd you keep it and not burn it before faking your own death is beyond me. So again, please, a bit of sympathy here. I'm in the middle of a storm, home alone, no internet, and now a possessed wedding dress is trying to get me. I mean, what would you do? I suspect you'd do the same as me. Stand still at the top of the stairs, just staring at the moving door. You'd fart too, right? I did a lot of that. Possibly my nerves, and soon there was no doubt how nervous I was. I was choking myself. And still the door moved. And then I think it caught my scent, if you get me, and it went freaking mad with some ghostly wails too. I ran like my life depended on it, into the safety of my bedroom and slammed the door shut. As I pulled on my headphones and remembered the lack of internet, I had a brief flash of how cavemen must have felt. I opened the drawers, slid them shut, made as much noise as I could. I even hummed a bit. It was okay, I could do this. Mum and Dad were coming home straight after the film. But I needed a wee. I thought about using the bin, the window, and spent so long weighing up different options, I realised I needed to go immediately. I eased open the bedroom door to an eerie silence, but oh my, the stench. It was not human. It was possibly from beyond the grave. And most definitely not my doing. It was still lingering. It didn't even smell like it was from this world. I retched as I dashed to the bathroom and locked the door. There was no way I was leaving the safety of that room again tonight. I filled the bath with the contents of every pretty-looking bottle I could find. Bubbles flowed over the side as I got in. But I felt tonight Mum would catch me a break, especially after all I'd been through, wouldn't she? For the first time that evening, I relaxed until the voice of a monster screamed my name. Tom! What is wrong with you? Why have you shut Mr. Fishlips in the spare room? He's pooed on the floor. I should have shouted back. Why did you call our cat Mr. Fishlips, Mum? But I didn't. I was just pleased she was home. And her awful wedding dress wasn't haunted after all. Home Alone by Lisa Williams. Written specially for ghastly stories, for gruesome children. Is there a room in your house that makes you feel a little bit nervous? The one that feels a little bit colder than the others? Can you feel a draft coming through the door? Is it because somebody's left the window open, or is it just because that room? I don't know. What scares you? Are you scared of the dark? I mean, that's entirely natural, isn't it? That's entirely natural. Of course we can't see what's happening. We can't see what's around it. But what's the irrational things that scare you? I mean, heights, as I get older, they got to me. But I've never liked heights. I've never minded looking down, but that's changed now. When I was young, I got frightened looking up. That's what frightened me, looking up. Now, I love reading old ghost stories. As I said before, I do not like horror films anymore. Oh, they frighten me, which technically is what they're supposed to do. But I love an old story. And this is a really good one. Futumch. I'm sitting on the stairs in the dark, rain lashing down. That is quite scary. Is there a smell of the grave around you, like the story? So this story is one of my favourites, and I have read it before, but it's always good, I think, to share. Let's have a chat about it afterwards and tell me what you think. I do this every Monday, actually, on Twitch. I'll be doing this at 9 o'clock. It's for grown-ups, really. At 9 o'clock on Twitch, I read a supernatural story. Tonight, I'm reading one from here, one of Roald Dahl's Book of Ghost Stories. Roald Dahl didn't write them. I don't think he probably even had much to do with them. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing them down. The confirmation there from Fatunch Orgo. No guffing. But this is a classic story. It's from 1902. That's 120 years ago. I hope you get from it what I get from it, which I do when I read it still. And if you're feeling brave, then afterwards I'll show you something. Settle yourself in for tonight's reading for Halloween by W. W. Jacobs, The Monkeys Paw. Part 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady sitting knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake, after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next time." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin, grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and a heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Oh, tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicond of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The Sergeant Major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly whilst his host got out the whisky and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange places. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see the old temples, and fakirs, and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me about the other day? A monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White, curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, having examined it, and placed it on the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major. "A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in a way that middle age is wont to regard the presumptions of youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you'd had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who think anything of it want to try the first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw and, dangling it between the forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the Sergeant Major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter, as the Sergeant Major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle," he said, colouring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, and then you can't be henpecked." He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact. It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200. Then that'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man, distinctly. The fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved!" he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand, like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I'll expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shrivelled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. Maurice said, "The things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I just... What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open, and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurried unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologised for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited, as patiently as her age would permit, for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I came from Moore and Meggins." The old lady startled. "Is anything the matter?" she asked, breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt. But he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly, as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat, staring blankly out of the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you and in your great loss," he said without looking round. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but, in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. Part 3. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realise it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten the load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of a subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden, wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlour, on the bracket," he replied. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad," he cried, aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly, and wish... Oh, my boy! My boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman. "Why not a second?" "A coincidence." "Go and get it, and wish," cried the wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her. His voice shook. "He's been dead 10 days. He's been dead 10 days, and beside, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognise him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back!" cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling in his chair, as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwed up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock. So quiet and so stealthy to be scarcely audible, it sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded throughout the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her and, catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" "What are you going to do?" "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling. Mechanically, "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let me go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son." "Let me go." "I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road. The Monkey's Paw for a Halloween night. Did you know that story? Have you heard it before? What did you think? I'd love to know. 120 years old and still chilling. Twisty-turny, nasty little story. Obviously these things are not based in any truth. Of course, superstition is a terrible thing. It can cause hopes and dreams. If you, knowing what you know now, knowing that fate is not to be meddled with, had the chance of 3 wishes, would you take them? And if you did, what would you wish for? That was scary. I think it's a horrible story. A really scary story. I love it. It's got a power to it. It's got a warmth to it, hasn't it? I think it's a perfect story to read. Of course, it's old enough now to be in the public domain. So here's what I'm suggesting you do. Go online and get a copy of the text. Save it into your notes. So the next time you find yourself camping out with some pals, everyone wants a story, don't they? You've got one to hand, one that you can read to them. If you do that, let me know. I'd love that. Thank you so much for sharing this Halloween with me. Or if you're watching it back, let me know what you thought. Thank you for the likes. They really, really help. Thank you for the subscriptions. I'm trying to naturally get my numbers up so that I can do some more portable live storytelling. YouTube. Apparently I can go out and buy a load of follows, but that feels a little bit unreasonable. If you'd like me to read more stories, let me know. I think I want to, but I do read stories every week. at 9 o'clock on a Monday. Grown-up ghostly stories on Twitch. That's what I do. And I'll be reading a story from Roald Dahl's Book of Ghost Stories. The Telephone is the one that I've selected, by Mary Treadgold. And that's at 9 o'clock on Twitch. Twitch.tv/Gavcross. If you're grown up, if you're over 18, you're welcome to join. Nice people there. And there's been nice people here as well. Thank you ever so much again for your company. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for Tumch. Whoa, says Danny. Thank you for that. Always happy to chat if you want to, or if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to do that. Other than that, have a good Halloween. Go off and bob your apples. Go off and work out how long your sweets will last. Will they last 2, 3, or 4 minutes? Or will you eke them out over the next few days? What kind of sweetie owner are you? My name's Gav Cross, and I'm a storyteller, and it's been a privilege to tell these stories to you. Good night.